So our first impressions with Daniel, one of the things we noticed were all of the cranes in the background and the development. And just that this neighborhood is really in a state of change. All of the single family homes that many people have talked about around the site itself, many of those will be developed into larger apartment buildings with higher density. But it's not just that. Already, even like taking that out of the equation, there are the sort of, how do we manage like the larger geography of the site with rainwater, and especially if there's increased runoff from all these new apartment buildings and that water coming down to the park, it's a heat island effect that we've all been thinking about as well. Like, how do we address those issues? So then moving beyond those site-specific elements of like the water flows of the site and the heat island, we also looked at culturally too, what's going on, where are there schools, where are there community centers, how does this relate? Like, how do people think about this neighborhood, get around it? Where's the transportation corridor? And so we digested all of that in, and I think we just kept on having more questions than answers. And we also were trying to think about inclusivity, as that's the big part of the slide. So this was like one of the first drawings that actually did on site, just being totally playful and like going the opposite approach of like, maybe we should start with like, what happens when you're not inclusive? What does that feel like? And then how can we work backwards from there and start to think about how we can include as many people in many different ways as possible? And also thinking about something that we hadn't really thought about, I think, much more, but like temporal inclusivity. Like, how are you inclusive over time, not just broadly inclusive, but like over a time span? How does that work? And then also how we look at things. Sometimes, like, it's really easy, I think, to be critical of a site at the beginning of like, oh, what's wrong? What are the issues? But we also found a lot of things we liked. It was open. The fact that it's flat means that there are like a lot of opportunities for specific programming. We saw Ultimate on the many site visits that we were there, and it wasn't just we saw this sort of laundry list of things that we wanted to fix. It was like, well, maybe there's something going on here too that we don't want to also interfere with, and maybe we're obviously not experts, but like maybe there's even another degree of humility that's required, and how can we look at that over a longer period, and how can we build in adaptability to the design process itself. So our sort of response to this is that to respond to the evolving needs of a rapidly developing neighborhood, we propose a phased, flexible park design that cultivates community connection within each stage of a co-design process. And that's something that Jenn is going to tell you much more about, how we imagine that getting started and what the stages of that look like.
So you might kind of be wondering why we're talking about phasing. I guess just to what Dante alluded to, like this neighborhood is facing a massive population influx, and at the same time, climate change is happening, and we're going to have to deal with a lot more stormwater. That in the RFP actually calls for a really sustainable stormwater management proposal. And we thought really like, what's the best way that we can kind of keep what's good about the park and what people really love about it, while also upgrading the rest of it. And to do that, we kind of started looking at some of the different precedents and thinking about things we wanted to include. So Franklin Park did a really good job of a youth and child engagement strategy that had 3D design elements with phasing. And then similarly, Emma Gardens had a lot of flexibility built into their form, and use a lot of reusable materials on site. Public Sediment in San Francisco, they did a really good job of connecting vulnerable people to the landscape and connecting them with the landscape processes. Whereas High Park in Calgary had a very concrete 3-phased park process that looked at really changing the park from its initial pilot steps. So we recognize that really the first step in our design process would be doing direct outreach with a number of user groups. So looking at Indigenous groups, cultural organizations, childcare facilities, sports teams, and school groups, and engaging them in a series of co-design and co-create workshops. So on site, this would look like having, or virtually, depending, would look like, oh, sorry, can you go back?
Sorry.
Yeah, so this would look like having a number of different kind of initiatives on site and allow for the ideation process to come through and to kind of prototype any sort of furniture, any sort of topography, or any sort of buildings with user feedback before actually building into site. Now, you can imagine as landscape architecture students, that makes our job a little bit difficult because we're kind of planning for the unknown. And so we started asking ourselves, how do we really design for flexibility? And we landed on this puzzle piece concept. So we recognize that any sort of organic design process is really going to be built from the outside in. And so we started thinking about the main arterial corridors to the site and thinking about basically making those our situated spots for the park lab and kind of building it in. And really trying to anticipate who's going to be, what it'll be like for people when they're there. These park labs would have like a series of roundtables and community members that would hopefully meet on a regular basis to do a bunch of different engagement and activities on site. So that could look kind of like doing different art workshops. You can go to the next slide. So that could kind of look like doing a number of series of art workshops. We could do community theater. We could do kind of the 3D modeling similarly to what they did in Franklin. We could have a series of learning gardens and then prominent tiling tiles that allow people to actually leave their mark on the landscape and to form part of this park for themselves.
So why the park lab? It's because we're too passive and we did not want to design. Now you may be wondering, how will this be implemented? Shout out to James for the aerial photos. During the first steps, we will solidify the main pathways, including the 43rd connection, establish satellite park labs in the corners, and a home base where the splash pad once resided. These satellite park labs are people's first introduction to the park. Each park lab is an opportunity to explore the activities with other visitors. When ideas are put forward, they become puzzle pieces, and for a short period of time, a designated area for that puzzle piece will be put in place for experimentation. If an idea sticks, it will be brought to the home base, and at home base, a decision will be made whether or not that program will become a permanent puzzle piece. The park lab is built on feedback, and the feedback that you'll provide us will be the most fruitful. You can say that the park lab project has already started. And when you look at that, it seems like Matt has already started implementing our idea. From here on out, everything is a possible permutation of the future over time. To fulfill the design aspect of our design project, these are the design decisions that we thought were appropriate for going into the future. The first major move being done here would be inserting permeable pavers. These pavers allow for flexibility on the site. They're not programmed, but they provide space for activities like food trucks, local vendors, markets, rest, and meandering. And with the possibility of increasing storm water levels, we thought it was important to create a blueway on Alberta Street. And because that's where most of the runoff takes place. And lastly, a learning garden is going to be a locally led workshop that teaches people how to garden with limited gardening space. And that's just an overview. And then in this scenario, people are proposing a tiling project along the 43rd corridor. And with some permanent modular infrastructure, these light posts and pergola sticks. And soon you might be hearing whispers about an amphitheater water basin. Now that Alberta Street has been integrated with 43rd, you can see that in detail that we still allow for vehicular access to the back alleys and emergency access if needed. And here you can see people casually occupying the area. And in an even more detailed section, we can see that most of the material palette is at play. The main pathway is recycled aggregate concrete paver for an accessible smooth surface. Most of everywhere else are permeable pavers to allow for runoff to seep in. A metal grate bridges itself over the swale, and wooden seatings are a place of rest. We were thinking that if there's continuous construction and deconstruction around our site, we can utilize the leftover material for our park. As for the planting palette, we initially focused on the placement of larger trees. The shade-tolerant ones go to the west, and the sun-loving trees go to the east. We further developed the planting palette to include grasses and shrubs. Following our previous rationale, they have been given 6 different locations: the Blueway, Wind Barrier, 43rd Corridor, Meadow, Scented Scenery, and Promenade Corridor. These are the area's color palettes throughout the seasons. And here are the different planting locations. The Blue is located on Alberta to catch all the runoff. The conifers shield the playground from the wind tunnel effect. 43rd corridor trees highlight the connection between the two. And with the possibility of using manure for the learning garden, the scented scenery is an attempt to mask it. The meadow is one of the more naturalized areas. And I can pass it off to Luc.
Hey, thanks, Nabil. You want to go to the next slide? So yeah, that's basically the tree outlay here. And if you want to go to the next slide again, you can kind of see this oval. Can you go back just this first page? Yeah, this is definitely a bold move. So we want to remind you that this is speculative. It's part of the joy of working as the Park Lab is not for sure. We present it to the community, but we did have a rationale for why we like to do an oval. To start off, it's a very inclusive design. Humans have been, sitting around in circles around a fire since we became humans, and that differentiates us from apes. So yeah, getting people together in a large oval is not the same as a circle. And part of that is due to the fact that we wanted to fit an ultimate field in the middle. So that's actually designed with the ultimate field dimensions in mind. And there's also a lot of opportunity around the edges, right? So there's like an amphitheater that can emerge. People can lounge in the sun. It's a nice sun-facing lounging spot. We have potential community gardens there, and as well as a running track, which can emerge on the outskirts of it. But why is it so big? It's massive. It's taking over the site, and that's because of, like Jen talked about, climate change. And like we saw in November last year, there's a lot of water that can show up all at once, and that's all running off from the top of Queen Elizabeth Park too. We got a catch basin here, and we really have to think about how this park can serve a really important role that makes us not only resilient socially with people and having a gathering spot, but also with climate change. And so this could really serve a key function. So if you want to keep going to the next slide. Actually go back. We calculated that I would go at 8,500 cubic meters for that water to capture. Anyways, next slide. Yeah, so like while this programming can happen at the edge with this community learning garden stuff, if you go to next slide, some ultimate frisbee practice might have to be canceled for a few days because it will be used by ducks instead while this water drains slowly. Next slide. So yeah, here's a few conditions of how this oval could emerge. People could actually be maybe playing with it if it's not too dirty. At some point when it's seeping and running pretty low, it could be a good splash surface. Next slide. And yeah, so like, again, this is like a speculative proposal, what our final plan could look like. We have the 43rd Avenue corridor really established there. We have this nice swale kind of going through the pavers that ends up in a treatment pond at the bottom near the meadow walkway. We have the amphitheater space. We have washroom and storage, which also may serve as the home base of the Park Lab. We have a harvest pavilion, which is kind of like for the community garden, learning garden area, storage and all that stuff. And then we have a nice playground at the top and spaces for market stalls to be emerged. So this is just, again, a speculation of what could end up being the case. Next slide. And yeah, there's this remainder of keeping it open for people to really define what they want. And this is part of our engagement strategy. Maybe people want basketball, maybe people want a bocce court, a dog park, or maybe a goat farm would be a pretty cool idea. So yeah, there's room for adaptability. And it's really about the process here and how we're working with this increasing population and growing the park along with it. And as well as growing it with the idea of climate change and stormwater events in mind. So we do introduce that cloudburst overflow in the treatment pond later in the phases, not right at the start. And we really allow the testing of the kind of the playground to see what's great about it, what's good about the baseball courts, what's great about the open space, and how can we have pop-up ideas emerge that may overtake what we just proposed. Next slide. Yeah, here's the grading plan. Can you just go back? You skipped through it. Yeah, the grading plan here is showing the 2 sections, the longitudinal one. Again, we're going to start with the transverse one here. Next slide. The transverse one here shows the 43rd Avenue, the swale, plaza, park lot, cloudburst overflowing garden, and really the hierarchy of shrubbery, really the conifers on the north side. So we allow for sun in the winter, but shade in the summer. Next slide. And highlighting this, this is more of a zoom up of what this interface between Alberta can look like. We have this plaza promenade, the commercial pedestrian 43rd Street, arguably would be up for decision. We have soil cells provided for all the trees, especially on the corridor. And then we have a lot of flexible zones that really rope people into the space. Next slide. And this is where I pass it off to you, Jen.
Yeah, I guess this is a perspective view of how we could imagine it. So I think maybe we kind of missed talking about some of the flexible pavers, but a lot of our form really is meant to be kind of like up and moved around. So, you know, in one area that could be concrete, another area could be open and be garden space. And this is just kind of showing the intersection on Alberta Street and 43rd Avenue, and to kind of show how that could become a public market area. And this is our longitudinal section of our imaginary or hypothetical park. So this one cuts through the playground and the kind of the flexible puzzle piece space, the plaza that continues from 43rd Avenue, the cloudburst oval flow, and then the meadow in the south. We did a zoom in of the playground. So we recognize too that like the playground is one of the most utilized structures on the site. And that's where we saw a lot of the people most of the residents using, apart from, of course, some of the open space for different types of sports. So we really want to build upon and modify some of the existing topography. So we try to build this in material using poured rubber surfaces and a bunch of different kind of climbing molds with netting. We kind of complement that with the stainless steel lighting fixtures and these permeable pentagonal pavers and some, recycled aggregate concrete. In perspective, this would kind of look something like this. So it'd be a nice big open space, lots of fun topography for kids to play on, and open access to the street with enough shade that people feel comfortable to be sitting there in the summer. And I guess just to end, like we really aim to keep the whole design of our park really flexible and open. And so this is just kind of showing how this oval flow could serve a variety of uses, from sports to movie nights, depending on what the community wants to watch that night. And I think that's all that we've got for you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.